All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to this MoGraph webinar. It's called Cinema 4D MoGraph Motion Graphics Made Easy. My name is Jonas Pilz. I work for Maxon since 2 years. I'm in the marketing team and I'm responsible for presentations, mostly in Europe, and also for workshops and stuff like webinars and quick tips and so on. And before I started at Maxon, I worked as a freelancer for a period of almost 5 years. And well, I worked mostly in industrial visualization. So you might ask yourself, why is this guy doing a MoGraph webinar now? The reason for this is the following. In industrial visualization, I had many jobs where I needed to distribute many objects through the whole scene. And I always was afraid of using MoGraph because, as I said, I was afraid, really, of having that many objects in the scene because I couldn't imagine that you can control them that easily. And then a colleague of mine said, well, we have a scene here where we need to have many objects, many same objects, and just use a MoGraph cloner for this. And then I used it. And in the next job, I did some landscaping. So I cloned some trees and distributed them randomly over a landscape and so on and so forth. And I used many cloner objects or generators, and I used many MoGraph effectors. And in the end, it turned out that I know MoGraph quite well, although I never used it within the motion graphics context. So I'm using MoGraph in the motion graphics context since I started working for Maxon, actually. And I really enjoy it. MoGraph is one of my favorite parts of Cinema 4D because you can achieve stunning results within a short amount of time. That's what always fascinates me. Okay. Having that said, let's start with some MoGraph basics. And I hope you all used Cinema 4D before, because then I can dive into MoGraph directly. So let's start with some MoGraph basics. And there are basically, three types of objects, so to speak. First is the generators. And the generators are there to create clones or to create MoGraph objects, so to speak. And those objects, which can be many, like thousands or millions, can be controlled by using effectors. And here you can see that we have a whole bunch of effectors, and every one of them does something completely different. So one effector is there to do or to affect all of the clones in the very same way. The other effector is there to randomize the clones in position, rotation, scale, whatever you want, color also. You can align objects onto other objects or make them look at other objects. You can use sound for modifying the clones and so on. And the third type of, it's not really objects, it's shaders, is how you can colorize all of those clones. There is a color shader that I will show you later. There's also a multi-shader, which is quite powerful, a beat shader, and also a camera shader that you can use as a camera within your scene, and you can directly render the view of that camera onto another screen, for example. All right. So, the MoGraph workflow. What you see in the middle here is the icon of a MoGraph cloner. And what you need to do in order to clone an object is you need to make it a child object of the cloner. And what will happen then is you will get many copies of that object. So in this case, it's a cube. And now here comes the interesting part. As soon as you assign an effector like in this case, it's the random effector, guess what will happen? Of course, this will randomize the whole thing. So you can randomize the positions, the scale, the rotations, whatever you want. And this is the basic concept. You have the cloner, you have an object input, you will get many objects out of it. And as soon as you apply an effector, like any effector, this will have an effect on the clones. Okay, keeping that in mind, I will show you what we will be creating in Cinema 4D. So let's start with this one, which is a countdown. And with this example, I will show you the basic concept of MoGraph inside of Cinema 4D. And yeah, we will create that whole setup within 10 minutes or so. Okay. This setup here, or the video that you see here, is rendered in Physical Renderer. And yeah, we will do that later. The next one, also rendered in Physical Renderer, is an example for playing around with dynamics, which is what we will do as well. And I will also show you how to use the exact same setup for visual effects. All right. The next one, this was also the key visual for this webinar. Yeah, it's a very abstract animation, and it's very easy to create. It's also rendered in Physical Renderer here. Then the next one, because it is Christmas time, we will have some Christmas animation going on. This one is rendered with the viewport. So this is a hardware OpenGL rendering, and you see many cubes, and some of them scale up like popcorn that pops up, and in the end there will be the shape of a star. Then I will introduce you into fracturing, and I will show you the basic concept behind the algorithm. So we won't create this scene here, but I will show you the basics behind fracturing, because it's very easy to understand this, so you can really unleash the potential of Voronoi fracturing inside Cinema 4D. Then what we will also create using fracturing, so this is also a fracturing setup, and this is also a call for you to think outside the box. Just because a feature is inside of a specific menu, it doesn't mean you can only use it within that context. And fracturing, which is normally there for breaking up objects, which is already a lot of fun, fracturing is such a feature that you can use like anywhere. You can use it in visualization, and you can also use it in motion graphics. This setup here is completely based on 4 parameters within the Voronoi fracturing object, and I will show you that later. And here is the last one, done by Simon Fiedler. And it also shows a very cool way to use Voronoi fracturing, because as you can see here, you can really animate the fracturing pattern, and this comes with a lot of potential. I actually don't know what renderer Simon used here, but yeah, all of the other renderings were done using Physical Renderer, except for the one where I told you that this is hardware OpenGL. Okay. So now you have seen what we will be creating, and let's go back to this example here again, because this is what we're going to be creating first, and I want to analyze the whole thing a bit with you. So what we have here is we have a few clones, and those are shaped like the number 5. And as soon as I hit play here, all of the clones fall down, and then they are being sucked up again and form like the next number. So it falls down. Now in the end it's 0. And yeah, this is what we're going to be creating. But first, let me show you the basic concept of MoGraph. So here is the starting scene. So we're almost starting from scratch. I just prepared those very complicated objects here in the beginning. And maybe let's make the cube and the platonic invisible here for now. And within the MoGraph menu, I will create a cloner. And what you have to do in order to clone an object is you have to make it a child object simply by dragging and dropping it underneath the cloner here. And now you see, all right, now we have 3 spheres. Let's have a look at the attributes of the cloner. In the object tab, we see the mode is linear. This is the reason for the spheres being like straight up, because the linear cloning happens here, like every clone is 50 centimeters up. Okay, then we can create a lot of them. We can also use another mode like radial, grid array, or even the very cool honeycomb array, like this. And yeah, what we want to do here is we want to clone all of those clones onto an object. But first, let me show you what will happen if I add some other objects also as a child object to the cloner. You see, we have the sphere, the cube, and the platonic. And here we have the sphere, the cube, platonic, sphere, cube, platonic, sphere, cube, platonic, and so on and so forth. And this is because the clones parameter here is set to iterate. We can also set it, for example, to random, and this will randomize the clones distribution in terms of the order here. All right. Now let's make this invisible and let's create our shape, because what we want to do is we want to clone all of these clones into the volume of a specific shape, and this shape should be a number. Okay, so let's go to the MoGraph menu and let's go to the MoText object. The cool thing about the MoText object is that all of those letters here are MoGraph objects as well, so they are MoGraph clones, and you can also modify them by using effectors on them. Okay, but first, let me align those clones to the middle, and let's also adjust the text to be 5. We want it to be a countdown. Let's also move it up a bit. We need that for later because we want to do the simulation. Okay, now let's go to frame 0 and let's add some keyframes. If somebody of you is not familiar with the concept of animating within Cinema 4D, there is a small circle left to the parameter names, and once you click this circle it turns red, and this means I have recorded the number 5 here at frame 0, so in the very beginning. And as I move forward to frame 50, for example, I type in 4 and set another keyframe. So now from here to here the number will adjust. Okay, let's move on to frame 100, type in 3, set a keyframe, and this is pretty straightforward. It's a very repetitive process, so let me do this without much commenting. And the last one, frame 250, and the text is number 0, and we set a keyframe. So now we are at 25 frames per second. So you might ask yourself, why did he use like 2-second steps in order to make the countdown work? And the answer is, well, actually, although it's a countdown, it doesn't need to be accurate in terms of every number has to be there at 1 second, because it just needs to count down, right? And we need the timing, or we need the time in order to have an appealing timing in the end to make the animation work at all. All right. Okay. The problem here is with the mode text that you cannot clone onto the mode text directly. I can show that to you if we select the cloner, adjust the mode to be object, and we input the mode text here. You see nothing right now because it's invisible, but now you see that there is just one object and it's not cloned onto the shape here. So instead what we have to do is we use a connect to make this whole object like a polygon object internally, simply by dragging and dropping the mode text underneath the connect. And instead of linking the mode text to the cloner, we use the connect. And now you see that all of the clones here are distributed onto the vertices of that object. That's basically not what we want, so maybe let's adjust this a bit. First of all, I want the connect object with the mode text included to be invisible, and we also want to make those clones render instances, because this works a bit faster, a bit more fluent in the viewport. And we also want to adjust the distribution here. As I told you, all of those clones are distributed onto the vertices of the object, and this is the reason why here we have straight lines. So we have a point here and a point there and then a point here, and here in the rounding we have a lot of points, and this is the reason for this many clones being here in this rounding. So let's adjust the distribution. We have many modes here. We can clone to the vertices, which is the default. We can clone to the edges, which I will do later with another setup, to the polygon center, to the surface, to the volume, and to the axis. And what we want to do is we want to use the volume as the distribution mode. And yeah, that looks quite good. Let's crank this up to 100. And whenever you see that a slider is not going further here, you can always crank it up, or most of the time crank it up using the arrow keys here, or by just typing in the higher number. Okay, maybe let's select the clones and let's make them a bit smaller. Something like this should work. Okay, and now before we start the dynamic simulation, I want to randomize the initial rotations and scales. And therefore we need an effector, and the effector we want to use is the random effector. So first make sure that you selected the cloner, because then the effector will be assigned to it automatically. If you don't do that, the effector will just be created, and I will show you later how to assign it then to the cloner. So first of all, let's create a random effector. And then you see that the positions are randomized now. This is because of the defaults within the random effector. So let's go to the parameters tab. And here you see the things that are randomized. So right now it's the position in X, Y, and Z. It's 50 centimeters randomization. And there's no scale randomization and no rotation randomization. So let's uncheck position. And let's check the scale. Let's also check uniform scale, and let's type in maybe 0.5. So now we randomized the scale, and now we also want to randomize the rotation by 90 degrees in every direction. And as you can see now, it looks quite interesting now because the rotations are randomized, and yeah, that's a pretty cool thing. Okay, next we want to apply dynamics to the whole setup. So first of all, let's create a floor object, because we need something to collide with. Okay, now we have those two objects, the cloner with all of the clones inside and the floor object. And what we want to do is we want to select both of them. So we select the cloner and the floor, and then we right click, go to simulation tags, and apply a rigid body tag to both of them. And the cool thing is, if you use a floor, this will immediately create a collider object, because yeah, Cinema 4D knows it doesn't make much sense to let the floor fall down and being part of the gravity simulation. But here we have a rigid body tag, and as soon as we hit play now, the whole setup falls down. But it falls down as a whole thing. Okay, how can we make every single clone a separate part of the simulation? And this is pretty easy. Let's go to the collision tab here, and there is an individual elements parameter that is set to off, and we adjust it to be all. And as we hit play now, I tell you, the whole thing will explode. And the reason for this is because we have intersections here, and intersections are not allowed, so there is a big force. And yeah, let me show you. I hit play and the whole thing explodes. Okay, so now what can we do about this? Because of course at some point all of the clones are meant to fall down, but in the beginning it should keep the 5, and later it should also keep the 4 for a while, and then the 3 and the 2. And there is a very cool parameter, or even 2 parameters within the forces tab, or the force tab, within the rigid body tag here. And this is the follow position and follow rotation parameters. So look at this. I set this to 1, so follow position to 1, and you see that gravity has an effect, but the clones fell down much slower, and this is because they are trying to keep their original position, but just by a factor of 1. And as soon as we crank this up to be like 10, you will see that we will have the shape of the numbers now. And because we animated this shape, we will get a dynamic transition between those numbers. Okay, let's also increase the follow rotation parameter in order to make the rotation animation a bit slower and more quiet. Maybe we are also a bit too big with the clones here, so maybe let's scale them down just a tiny bit more. And here we go. So this is already a cool effect, but as I showed you in the example, I want those numbers to fall down and then to go up again. And we can do this simply by animating these parameters here. So let's go to frame 20 and let's set 2 keyframes, one for follow position, one for follow rotation. And then let's go 1 frame further to frame 21 and let's set a keyframe for a value of 0 for both parameters. And if we go to the start and press play, you see here's the 5 and then it falls down. Okay, next we know that at frame 50 there will be the 4. So let's go to frame 50, set another set of keyframes and go a bit further to maybe frame 65, and let's crank it up to 10 again. And this way we will have the 5 in the beginning, it will fall down and then being sucked up again to shape the 4. So now you saw that there was a sphere created up here, and we want to get rid of this simply by going to the cloner and adjusting the seed of the random distribution here to some other value. It doesn't matter which value, it's just important that there is no more popping up of a clone here. Okay, now it works. Okay, now we need this animation of the clones falling down and being sucked up again for every single number. So let's bring up the timeline, and you can do that by going to Window, and let's use the timeline in dope sheet mode, which is this here. And here we see our keyframes. Those are the keyframes for the numbers. So here we have 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. And those are the keyframes that we set up for the dynamics tag. And by holding down Command on Mac or Control on PC and dragging those keyframes, you create copies of them. So let's do that a few times, holding down Command or Control, depending on the system you work with. And yeah, let's just drag and drop them over, like so. Okay, now let's have a look at the animation. Let's go back here, and we have the 5. It falls down, shapes the 4. Oh, but this is already, yeah, this is pretty fast. So you can see the numbers for a minimum of a second, but this is way too fast. So let's select those keyframes here. Those, and those, and let's move them a bit further to the right. So maybe let's make 15 frames instead of just 5. And this should be a much better timing now. So all of the clones fall down, being sucked up. 4, fall down. 3, fall down. 2, fall down. Oh, there are some more clones appearing here, but that's just a matter of the seed. Okay, so this was the first setup. I don't want to lose time here, so I want to jump right into the next thing. And the next thing was, we want to play around a bit more with dynamics, like in this example here. So let's jump into Cinema 4D, and let's change the scene. So by pressing the V key, you get this this menu here, and I use it very often for jumping between projects, because here you see all the projects that are opened. And let's jump into the dynamic spheres setup here. So this is pretty much the same setup as I built before. You see there's a cloner with 4 spheres in it, and a dynamics tag is applied. Follow position and follow rotation are set to 10, and as I hit play, you see this is what happens. Okay, now let's create another sphere, and let's maybe scale it up a bit, and let's make a right click and go to the simulation tags and make it a collider body. Alright, as soon as we hit play now, all of those spheres here want to, or try to keep their original position, but we have a big sphere here as a collider. And the cool thing now is that I can move the slider here, the sphere, and all of the clones will react to it. And this is already something that I can play with like all day long, because it's so much fun. But the other thing that you can do is you cannot only move the collider object, you can also move the cloner itself. And this is quite important, because if you know that, you can, for example, or maybe let's get rid of the sphere here, and let's create a ground floor, and let's apply a collider body here. So what you can do now is you can use the spheres here, or maybe let's get rid of the plane effector. Okay, and now you can use this and move it around, and as you can see, the spheres will stay at the surface. And this is quite interesting if you know that, because what you can do now is you can use that for a visual effect setup, and I prepared one for you, which is the Avalanche. And as you can see here, I created an avalanche, and this is a dynamic simulation running here, but it's also very controllable. It's following a spline. Yeah, and this line makes like a slalom in between those pylons, and none of these pylons gets hit. This is pretty cool, and if we change the camera, you can see it from above. So here's a dynamic simulation, but it's very controllable because we use exactly this setup. Now this is a cached animation, so maybe let's go back to frame 0 and let's delete the cache so I can show you what you can do with that, or how you can adjust it to be less controllable or more controllable. So now it's not cached anymore. We changed the collision shape here from moving mesh to automatic. That will speed it up a bit, because now we're running a live simulation, not a cached one. And yeah, let's see. We go to the forces tab, and you see the follow position parameter is set to 4 here. If we bring it down to 2, you will see that there are some pylons which are also part of the dynamics simulation, so they are also rigid bodies. You see that they will be hit by the rocks and yeah, taken with them. And once we crank this up to, let's say, 10, you see that there is yeah, really this bunch of rocks, and it's staying together pretty well. So my favorite value here was 4. That was a bit more natural. Yeah, so this is this setup, and as I told you before, I really want to encourage you to use MoGraph yeah, in many other branches or in many other projects than just motion graphics objects, because this is a part of Cinema 4D which is so powerful, and you can use it like everywhere. Okay, so let's go to the next one, which I think is the key visual setup here. Yeah, exactly. So what do we have here? Well, let me drink first. Sorry. Okay. What we have here is many objects that look a bit like cylinders, but they are concave. So maybe let's pause this animation, and here you can see it good. It's a cylinder, but it's concave, and it also seems to follow a shape that was defined before and also animated. And yeah, we will recreate this from scratch. So let's jump back into Cinema 4D and let's create a new file, and we will start by creating one of these cylinders. So let's create a cylinder. Let's make the radius 3 and the height 100 centimeters, and we also need some height segments. And the reason for this is, maybe let's turn on the lines here. We need this resolution here, those lines here, in order to deform this whole thing in a concave way, like I showed you. Okay, what we also need is a fillet. So we have round ends here. And yeah, let's deform the whole thing to be concave. So what we need for this is a deformer. To be more specific, it's the bulge deformer. And deformers work like that. You can apply them to your scene, then you have to make them a child object of the object you want to deform. And what you can do then is, for example, you can press the fit to parent button and it will automatically fit to the parent. But there is another cool thing where you can do exactly the same what I did now with just one click and the press of a modifier key. Okay, let's select the cylinder. That's important. Then let's go to the deformers menu, and before you create the bulge here, press and hold Shift, because as soon as you create it, then it will automatically create it as a child of the selected object, and it will also press the fit to parent button automatically for you. And now you can start right away with reshaping it. And we want to bring it down to like so. And let's also make the bulge deformer invisible here. And this is our, let's say, Q-tip object. Now let's create the shape we want it to be cloned on. Yeah, I will start with a platonic, because I think the platonic is the new cube. And yeah, first maybe let's directly clone all of those, or this object, onto the edges of this object. Okay, we select the cylinder and we go to the MoGraph menu, and before we create the cloner, we press and hold Alt, and this will automatically create the cloner as a parent object of the cylinder here. So it is cloned automatically. This is what you can see here, but by default it's of course again the linear mode here. Let's adjust it to be object mode, and we want to apply the platonic here. And now you see that those clones are distributed onto the vertices again. That's not what we want, so let's adjust them to be edge. And here you see that it's working pretty well. Okay, but what we also want to do is we want to make the Q-tips fit the whole length of the object here, or of the edge here, and this can be done by the scale on edge checkbox. So by default it's set to 50%, but you can also set it up to 100%. And now we have that. Okay, now as we play, nothing happens. So what we just created is the basic setup for it. Now, here comes the interesting part. We want to deform the platonic here. And there are multiple ways to do that. Of course, you can use one of the deformers here, but you can also use, and that's very cool, you can also use an effector. So let's create the random effector as a child object by pressing and holding the Shift key. And here you see it's now a child object of the platonic, but nothing happens. And this is because you need to tell the random effector, or any effector, to work like a deformer. And this can be done in the Deformer tab of the effector. So let's go to the Deformer tab. There is just one parameter that you can adjust, which is Deformation. And let's set it to point, and bam, you see now the whole thing is deformed. But as I hit play, nothing happens again, and this is because if you go to the Effector tab here, the random mode is random, and random creates randomness, but just for one time, and then it keeps this randomness unless you animate the seed here. So there are a couple of random modes. Random and Gaussian are static modes. I think sorted is also a static mode, and noise and turbulence are animated modes. So let's use noise and let's press play. And here you see that it now works perfectly. Maybe let's get rid of the font tag here. Okay, maybe let's also make the platonic invisible. And this is the animation we have now. So yeah, it's a bit too fast for my taste. So let's go to the Effector, tab, and let's bring down the animation speed to something like 20. And maybe let's also check this indexed. This will create a randomness for every single parameter. So also the split up positions, like position is split up into X, Y, and Z, and every single part, so to speak, gets its own randomization. All right, so that's basically the setup here. So for my taste, it's also a bit too less of movement here, so it could be a bit stronger. And as I told you, many sliders provide you with values that are higher or lower than what they are showing here. So here we can go from 0 to 100%, but we can also go higher, or we can even go lower, whatever you want. I will set it to something like 250. That should be good. And that's the full setup. All right. Yeah, maybe let's apply some basic shading and to finish this scene up. Okay, first of all, maybe let's create a background first. Background object. Then make a double click here in the material manager. Make another double click to open up the material editor. And let's uncheck the color and the reflectance and just go with luminance. And let's create a gradient. We wanted to make like a circular gradient. Invert the knots and yeah, make the color a bit brighter. Let's assign it to the background. Hit render for one time here. And now we just need to apply a glass material to this thing here. Okay, let's create another material, and this will be very basic though. So let's also deactivate color and reflectance, and let's just activate transparency. It should be a glass material, so normally you would need to know the refraction index of a glass material. Yeah, but Cinema 4D comes with this refraction preset parameter, and you can use glass from here. So this is the correct refraction index for glass. And now all we need to do is we need to apply it to the cloner or to this one and then hit render. Yeah, and this is pretty much the whole setup that I use. Of course, you can crank up the reflectance, and you can also use physical renderer, for example, and use a camera in order to get a depth of field effect. That's also what I did in this example here. You can see the depth of field, but I won't go into this because I want to continue with the next setup, which is this one. So let's analyze this, and let's take another sip of water. Okay, what we have in the beginning is a 20 by 20 grid of cubes, and then some of the cubes are scaled up and push everything else to the side, so there is a dynamic simulation, and yeah, looks like something like a popcorn effect. Alright, so let's recreate this, and therefore we will jump into Cinema 4D, and we will start with an empty scene again, and yeah, let's create a cube, because it's cubes that we want to clone. Let's set it to 20 by 20 by 20, and let's also create some sort of fillet, like so. And now let's clone this using a MoGraph cloner. So let's go to the MoGraph menu, and while holding Alt, create the cloner. This way it will be created as a parent. And let's set the mode to grid array mode. Now we have a 3-dimensional grid, but actually we just want it to be 2-dimensional. And maybe let's do it like this. Oh wait, we said we want to set it to 20 by 20. So let's set it to 20 by 20. This is our grid, and now we want to use an effector on it to get the popcorn effect. So we will use the plane effector for this, and the plane effector basically does the very same thing to all of the clones by default. So once we create this, you will see all of the clones moving up by 100 centimeters, and this is because yeah, it's set like this in the defaults. So if we go to the parameters tab, position is activated, and all of the clones are moved up by 100 centimeters. But what I want to show you first is how you can bring some power into the plane effector, and this is via fall-offs. Every single MoGraph effector comes with a fall-off, And we can adjust the fall of shape, for example. So now let's set it to linear, and this way we can blend between the affected state of the clones and the non-affected or the original state of clones. And this way we can create effects like this, or we can also set it to sphere, for example. Now we have a spherical fall off, but we can also set it to source, and this is what we want to do here. With the source fall of shape, we can define an object that should be used as the fall off, or the distance to this object should be used as a fall off. That's why we have a source link field here, and yeah, we need an object here. And the cool thing is you can pretty much use any object. So yeah, let's go to the simulate menu, because we will use a particle emitter for this. Let's create a particle emitter, and let's rotate it to be aligned the same as our clone setup here. Let's scale it up so it's the same size, something like this. And for setting it up, let's also move it up. And let's press play, and there you go. We have many particles being emitted from this particle emitter. And what we want to have is that the particles are emitted, but they should stay in the same place as where they were created. So let's select the emitter, and let's bring down the speed to 0. And when we hit play now, you see that there are these small white dots here, and those are the particles which are created. But those are too much, so let's bring down the birth rate here in the editor and the renderer, and now you see that there are just a few particles created here. Okay, let's leave it like that, but move it down to be in its original position again. So now the particles are created in the same or at the same height as the clones here. And we will go to the plane effector, to its fall off tab, and drag and drop the emitter to the source link field. And once you hit play, you see nothing happens. And this is because we need to set the distance, the sample distance that is used to create a fall off from the object, or the particle in this case, to its outer, let's say rim, like here. Let's say the radius is 20 centimeters, then we will have an effect like this. That's a bit, that's too less, so let's set it to 40. And what you can see here also is that now all of the clones are moved up where a particle is created. So here in the middle you can see the particles, and all of the clones here around the particle are moved up. So let's set up the plane effector to do what we want it to do. We don't want them to be moved up, we want them to be scaled, uniformly scaled. And let's set the scale parameter to 1. And let's also set up the color mode here. So therefore, we want to adjust the original color of the whole setup. So let's go to the cloner, let's select it, and let's go to its transform tab, because what you can do here is you can set an initial color. And we want it to bring, we want it to be black or almost black. So if it's a darkish gray, you can see better what you're doing. And now let's select the plane effector, and within the parameters tab, let's set color mode to on. And now those clones here are not only scaled up, but also colorized. So now we have black and white representation of the effect of the plane effector onto the clones. So let's go to frame 0, and let's go to the front view, and let's move everything up a bit. So it seems to be standing on the ground, and maybe let's also create a floor object like so. And now we can start creating a dynamics simulation, because what we have now is the setup here. And yeah, this is pretty straightforward, what you've seen before. So let's select the floor object and also the cloner. Let's make a right click, simulation tags, rigid body. Okay, let's hit play, and you see the whole thing moves, but it doesn't move the right way, because what we wanted to move like is every single clone should be a separate object in terms of the dynamic simulation here. So let's go to the rigid body tag here, to its collision tab, and set individual elements to all again. And now you see that something is happening here. Maybe we can deactivate or make the emitter invisible here. And this is the effect we are having here, which is already pretty cool. But now let's make it a star shape in the end. So what I basically did to create the star shape that we have here is I created another collision shape, and I used a sweep for that. So let's create a star first. Let's adjust the plane and scale it up like so. And let's create another spline on the end side. It should be pretty small. This will be our profile. And now let's create a sweep, and both of the paths here, or of the splines, should be child objects of the sweep. And now we created some new piece of geometry. Let's move that up a bit like so, and let's also scale it up, but just in Y direction, so we have a better collision shape. Or maybe let's set it to 20 here. So this is our collision shape. Now let's create a simulation tag for that, collider body. And now you have to know that by default, which is the automatic shape here, the dynamics engine works with convex collision shapes only. So it will turn the star here into a solid object, where everything that is inside here will be treated as a collision, and it will also get rid of those corners here. So it will basically create an n-gon instead of a star. So we need to adjust the collision shape here, and this is what you can do with this parameter here. We set it to static mesh. A tip here: if you have it as low poly as possible, the dynamics calculation will be faster. Okay, and now let's hit play and see what happens. Yeah, that's exactly what we want. The cubes are popping up, and they end up being in the shape of the star here. So let's make the sweep invisible, and maybe let's also extend the timeline a bit, something like this. And then we see that we have the star shape in the end. Okay, one more cool thing. We were talking of a popcorn effect. So what if we wanted those cubes to be like the kernel of the corn, and those white cubes here, the popped version? This can be done pretty easily. Maybe let's create another object, like let's create a platonic for that. And let's set the radius to 12. And let's place it underneath the cloner as well. And now as we go to the first frame, you see that those two clones are represented here. It's always the cube, platonic, and so on. And yeah, this is because the clones mode here is set to iterate, but we can set it to sort. This way it will use the first one, unless it is told by an effector to use another object, so this object. So what we can do within the plane effector is we can bring up the modify clone parameter to 100%, and this way it will use the second object here instead of the first to be cloned in those areas where the plane effector has an effect. So let's have a look at this, and you see the stuff is popping up, and here we have the platonics. So this is the popped version. Yeah. Okay, now let's colorize the whole thing. And we will use the color information from the plane effector in a material. So let's create a new material. Create new material. And let's also assign it to the cloner. Double click on it to open the material editor. And what we want to do now is we want to get rid of the color, and we want it to be based on the reflectance only. Let's get rid of the specular, and let's create a GGX reflection. And yeah, now we want to adjust the color. Therefore, we select the triangle here and go to MoGraph shaders, color shader. I told you before that we want to use the color shader in one of the setups, and here we go. We use the color shader. And what happens now is it looks at the cloner, looks at what effectors are affecting the cloner. Is there any effector affecting the color? Then picking the color and linking it into the color shader. And now we have those two colors, black and white, in our colorization of the reflection. But what we actually want to have is, for example, red cubes and white platonics. And the way we can achieve this is by using a colorizer. So let's go to the colorizer, and there you go. You see that there's something happening. Let's open up the colorizer, and we will get rid of the black here, and we will set the yellow side to be white, and maybe the red one to be a bit darker, just like that. And this is how you can colorize clones. And yeah, this is basically the whole setup for this. So what we did here is we colorized the frame, we colorized the clones. We made this popcorn effect with different objects, and we created collision shapes. And yeah, I think this is a pretty cool setup. So have fun with it. All right, let's go to the next one, which is a fracturing setup. Okay, first I want to explain to you the basic principle behind fracturing. Okay, let's go to the model sculpture here. So we have a stature here, the stature of David, and we want to fracture him. So maybe let's rotate him first, like so. And let's apply a Voronoi fracturing object, which can be found here in the MoGraph menu, because every single fragment here will be treated as a clone. Press and hold Alt as you create it, and then you will see that David's body is already broken up. In this case, we have to optimize and close the holes to make the result more reliable. And just to show it to you, we use the rigid body tag and press play, and it falls down and smashes. Okay. But what you can also do, as I told you, all of those clones are actually MoGraph objects. Maybe let's go to the Sources tab. This is the heart of the fracturing object, because here you can set up the sources. And I will show you in a minute that the way how you set up the sources brings the power with fracturing. With this you can unleash the full potential of it once you know how the algorithm works. But first of all, I want to show you that the clones are also reacting to effectors. So here you go. And if you use, let's say, a linear fall off here, linear, maybe let's rotate it and move it, you can see what happens here. Right? Okay, so this is the proof that this is part of the MoGraph context. And now to explain the basic concept to you, let's bring the point amount down to 2. And what you can see here is that the algorithm works as follows. Within a volume, there are points that will be scattered. And right now we have 2 points, this point and this point. And as you can also see, there will be a cut directly in the middle between those 2 points. And this is important because this is how Voronoi fracturing works. So let's bring the point amount up to 3. Now we have 3 points here. So 1 here and here. Here's the cut in the middle. Then we have here, and the cut in the middle is that. All right, maybe let's change the seed. Okay, that's a good example here. So now let's have a look from above. You see that we have 3 points, 1 here, 1 here. This is the cut directly in the middle. 1 here, 1 here. This is the cut in the middle, and 1 here, 1 here. And the cut that is referring to those 2 points is this one. Okay, so keeping that in mind, we will create the next thing. So I will just create the basic setup for this, not the whole animation, because it involves quite a bit of Espresso. And yeah, let's hit play. So everything that you see here is done with Voronoi fracturing. So in the middle we have this baseline, so to speak, and then there is another set of lines. This is all geometry, this is not a shader. And another one, and so on and so forth. And yeah, we will create that now. Okay, let's create a new file and let's create a platonic. Okay, here we go, platonic. And we want to fracture it. So we go to the MoGraph menu, Voronoi fracturing, press and hold Alt to make it a parent object immediately. And yeah, this is how it works. Okay, now let's use another source. So this here is a sources list. Of course, you can use many sources, but we want to use just one in this example. And what we want to use as a source is another platonic, and we will call this the source platonic. And now, with the Voronoi fracture selected, we drag and drop the source platonic into the sources field here. And now look what happens. So maybe we should also bring up the offset fragments so we can see better what happens. Now the Voronoi fracture algorithm will use the points of the source platonic, which are the same points as in the platonic here, as the fracturing points to create the pattern. So we have a point here, we have a point here. This is the cut in the middle. We have a point here, and we have a point here. This is the cut in the middle. Here and here, this is the cut in the middle. And this is how this pattern is created. Only by cuts in the middle. And this concept, as I told you before, is very important to understand. It's not very complicated. You just need to know that, because then you can you can do whatever you want using fracturing, because you understood the concept behind it. Okay, let's get a bit further. So maybe later we may want to change the source, and we will create a few more Voronoi fracture objects using the very same source. So what we will do first is we will create a connect object, place the source platonic underneath it, and instead of linking the source platonic here to the sources tab, we will link the connect object. Okay, I will show you what is this for later. Okay, now let's go to the object tab. And Voronoi fracturing was introduced to Cinema 4D with release 18, and we already had the offset fragments parameter and the hull only parameters there. But what was added in release 19 were the invert checkbox here and the thickness for the hull only. And the whole setup here relies on those 4 parameters. So first, let's increase the fragment offset, which will create just a bigger gap between those fragments. And let's invert this. And what this will do is it won't show the fragments themselves, but it will make geometry out of the gaps in between the fragments. And this is a really nice effect, even now. But what we can also do is we can check hull only. And imagine you can do this with any kind of object. And we will set the thickness, not the thickness, the thickness to 4. And this way we created our inner line, so to speak. Okay, now let's create some more of them. Let's make a duplicate of this one simply by holding down Command on a Mac or Control on a PC. And let's also make the old one invisible. And with this Voronoi fracturing, we crank up the offset fragments to 10. So this way we create a wider line here. And now what we need to use, or what we need to do, is we need to cut directly here in the middle of those lines. And guess how you can do that? It's very simple. You can do that simply by creating another Voronoi fracture object and using the same source again. And yeah, let me show you. So with this Voronoi fracture object selected, we will create another one as a parent. And yeah, by default, you know, there is this random point generator. Let's get rid of that and let's bring in the connect and see what happens. So now it uses the very same points that are in the middle of the holes here to fracture this again. And the cool thing is that this creates those parallel cuts, and we can also again use the offset fragments here. Let's set it to 6, and this way we created a pair of lines for every single line. And maybe let's now make the Voronoi fracture here, the baseline, visible again. And now everything you need to do in order to make this more complex is just copy this over and adjust the values here. So this must be 18 and this must be 14. And this way you create a gap like this. Okay, now yeah, let's say we want another source here, not the platonic. So maybe let's get rid of that first. Maybe let's make it invisible. And let's create a cube instead and place it underneath the connect. The cool thing is that we now use the connect in every single Voronoi fracturing object here, and whatever you place as a child of the connect object will now be the source for the fracturing. And this is really, really useful to know that. Okay, let's go back to the source platonic, because another thing that you can do is you can animate this. For example, again, you've seen that before, by using a random effector, press and hold shift to make it a child of the source platonic, and let's make it a deformer, and there you go. And of course, this whole thing can also be animated the same way as I showed you before. So as I hit play, you see that the whole pattern follows the animation of the source Platonic here. Yeah, that's the basic concept behind it. And then you need some Expresso and wire it all up in order to create this here in the end. Okay, so let's go to the last setup here that I want to show you, which is this one done by Simon Fiedler. I will play it again and we will analyze it. So what we have here is one piece in the beginning, and there will be many pieces that will be created out of that. And then it starts randomizing everything here. Okay, and this is what we want to create. So first of all, we want to create this here, more, to that point. Then we want to create this random pattern and also make it animate automatically, and then we will also move those fragments separately. Okay, let's jump into Cinema 4D again and create a new file, and let's create another cube. Let's make it really flat for the beginning. I will bring it up again later, and let's fracture it. For Neu Fracture, press and hold Alt to make it apparent. Then let's get rid of the random point generator, and now let's use an object which is the matrix object. So if you might ask yourself, what is the matrix? The matrix object is pretty much the same as the cloner, but the cloner really clones objects, and the matrix object doesn't clone anything, but it creates all of the positions, rotations, and scales for all of the objects that normally would be cloned. And the cool thing about this is, first, you can use it in fracturing, and second, it is very fast and you can apply effects to it, also getting rid of clones and such things. And then you could use the cloner and set it to object mode and clone onto all of the matrices, and then you need to calculate less clones, which will make Cinema 4D faster. Okay, so now let's create a matrix object, and let's set it to 1 in height, and maybe let's also scale it down a bit, just like so, and let's make it a source object. And now you see, look at this. Let me set the offset fragments parameter to 1 so we can see it even better. Now you can see that there is a cut between all of those matrices, and this creates a very geometrical pattern as well. So we pretty much diced our initial plane here. And yeah, what Simon did was, with the matrix object selected, he had just one in the beginning, one matrix, set a keyframe, and then he brought it up to, let's say, 7 by 1 by 7, something like that, and set another keyframe. And now you see, if you hit play, bam bam, here we have a lot of fragments now, and this was all animated. Okay, the next thing is to randomize the whole thing, and I think you already know what I'm doing next. I'm going to randomize not the fragments themselves, but I want to randomize the positions of the matrices here. So that's important. You have to select the matrix object first, and then you go to Effector, Random. And as soon as those matrices are randomized, you also see that the pattern here is randomized. Yeah, so let's go to the parameters tab here, and let's bring y down to 0. And yeah, maybe this is the time where we can make the matrix object invisible. And where we can also set the random mode to noise and create another animated noise pattern, fragments pattern here. Let's bring it down to 20% in speed and also 20% in scale, and also set this to indexed. And let's see, now this is our animation. All right. Maybe let's bring down the scale of the matrix a bit more. All right. So now if we hit start, we see that we immediately create those random movements, or this random, pattern. And what we want to have first is this very geometrical pattern, and then let's turn it into the random pattern. And the way how you can do this is simply by animating the strength parameter here. So using the strength parameter in the random effector can make a soft transition between the like perfect parallel cuts and the random stuff. So let's go to frame 60, set a keyframe at 0, and then let's go to frame 70 and let's bring this up. Okay, then let's go to frame 1 and press play. And here you see that we first create this cubes or dices, and then the whole thing will animate to be randomized. Maybe let's have a bit more time here, something like that, and then it moves. All right, this is cool. And I want to create another random effector, but this time for the Voronoi fracture object. And in the beginning, I promised you that I want to show you how you can assign an effector to a MoGraph generator. Also, if you forgot to select it first. So let's create a random effector without selecting the Voronoi fracture object. And now we have it here. Let's call this random fracture. And now you see that nothing happens because this random effector is not linked to the Voronoi fracture object. But within the Voronoi fracture object, there is another tab that is called Effectors. And here we have the Effectors list. And as you can see, nothing is inside of that list, but you can use, or you can drag and drop the random fracture effector here and just drag and drop it into that list, and then you see that it works. Okay, then let's go to the Effectors parameter tab, and let's just use the scale here. Maybe set it to 2, and let's also bring up the scale of the cube here in Y direction. And now you see that it works like that. Oh, it's randomized from the beginning, so let's do the very same as we did before. So we go to the random effector, to the effector tab, and set two keyframes, one at 100%, and let's go a bit more to the previous frames, and let's bring it down to 0. Okay, so here we go. Randomization, and also randomization in Y scale. Okay, so that's it for the setups. So let's jump back into the keynote. And as you might know, Cinema 4D has a very tight integration within After Effects, and both applications are very good in the motion graphics context. So if you want to do 2D motion graphics, then After Effects is your tool. But as soon as you want to create 3D parts within your motion graphics, you will need to have Cinema 4D, and those two work really well together using our Cineware plugin, so to speak. So you can import Cinema 4D files natively into After Effects, which is pretty cool, and you can export the cameras and lights and so on and use them within After Effects. And one thing that you could do with that is something like this. So the spheres or the balls were inside of this thing, and I animated the BMX rider. No, I'm just kidding. Of course, all of the spheres here are a bunch of MoGraph clones with the variation shader, and yeah, also using scene reconstruction for reconstructing the whole parkour here. And yeah, that's the setup here. And here are some other things that you might want to know. MoGraph good to knows. Okay, so first, MoGraph works very well with dynamics and particle forces once they are dynamic. So I showed you the dynamic. What I didn't show you is that you can use the particle forces on that. So things like turbulence, for example, or attractors. Then the next thing, effectors in point mode work like deformers. That's what I showed you 2 times with the random effector. And with render instances, your viewport gets faster. I already told you that as well. There are some MoGraph nodes in Expresso. So if you are Expresso people, feel free to use them, to use the MoGraph nodes within Expresso, because you can do very cool stuff with that. And for programmers with Python and Coffee, MoGraph gets even more powerful. So if you create a Python effector, you can really create any effect that you want. So now this is the time for questions. How to make spheres bouncy after falling. So this is also pretty easy and straightforward. So all you need to do is use soft bodies instead of rigid bodies. So maybe let's create a new scene, and let's create a floor object, and also let's create one sphere using hexahedron, because what you need to know is that soft bodies work best if you have like quads as polygons here. And now let's bring down the segments, because soft body dynamics can really slow down your setup pretty fast. Let's go to simulation tags, rigid body, or actually we need soft body, so let's go to soft body and let's turn them on. So this would be the soft animation here. This is how you make them wobbly. But there's also another tip. If you want to deform a high poly object using soft body dynamics, it is always good to, well, maybe let's create this. So let's say we have a sphere here. This is low poly, and we actually want a very high poly sphere. Let's set this to a higher segment count, and let's place it in the same position as this one. Let's copy this over to that. So now they are in the same position. And what you can do is you can use a deformer, which is the mesh deformer, in order to deform the high poly object using the low poly object. And you're running the simulation on the low poly object, because then the simulation will be faster, but you will deform the high poly object in the end. So let's go to the mesh object, and the cage for this one will be the low poly sphere, and we need to initialize this once. And then let's go and make the sphere, the low poly sphere here, invisible, and let's play the animation. Yeah, I know that it works. Maybe let's say, yeah, you have to set this to surface, then it works. So what we see here is the high poly sphere, and it is deformed using the low poly sphere. So that might be a cool tip if you want to do soft body animations. Always use low poly objects to run the simulation, and then deform a high poly object with it. How did you get the right position of the balls going away from the biker in the After Effects Cinema 4D example? Okay, let's jump back into this. So what I did was I filled the whole geometry here with the balls, and then I had another object, a collider object, which I animated at the position of the biker here. It was really, in some cases it was frame by frame adjusting it, but yeah, that's a collider I created within Cinema 4D, and I also used it as a mask. So what you can see here is that there are some balls in front of the biker and some behind him, and yeah, this is because I used this collider, which was like this size. I always try to have it bigger than the biker actually is, so I could get this mask. Yeah, that is the answer for this question.
Okay, there was another question that I want to answer, which was how can you gain control over a single clone independently from the others? And well, there are two answers. The first is via Python. So if you know programming, you can get really full control over a single clone. And there is also a way to use the formula effector, yeah, in order to gain control for a single clone. And yeah, maybe let me show you how to do this. Let's create another cube and make it smaller, and let's clone it. Maybe let's also adjust the distribution here and increase the count. Okay, so first of all, what you need to know is that every single clone comes with its own name, so to speak. And this name is a number, which is called the index. And what you can do within Cinema 4D inside of the cloner is you go to the Transform tab, and within the display options, you choose index. And this way, you can see the numbers. So it starts at 0. That's yeah, where counting starts in programming in general. You always start at 0. So if you want to count, or if you want to have the fifth clone, you count 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 actually. So this is the fifth clone, but it has the index 4 because it starts at 0. All right, so now keeping that in mind, we get rid of the index display. That was just for a basic explanation, and let's apply a formula effector. And yeah, maybe you wouldn't expect the formula effector to be capable of picking out a single clone, because by default it has this yeah, weird sinus animation and this formula, which is, well, quite complicated, but yeah, yeah, maybe it makes you also afraid of using it. But what you can do um, is you can unfold this variables thing here, and there you see all of the variables you have, and there is one called the object index, which is ID, and it's also here in that formula. But yeah, if you adjust the formula to something like ID equals, and let's say we want to pick out the fifth frame, we need to type in 4 because it starts counting at 0, and then it uses the fourth frame, or the fifth clone here. And as you hit play, nothing happens anymore because there is no sinus attached to the formula here, or part of the formula. Okay, let's go to the parameter tab, and here you see what you can set up. So let's, for example, move it up, and maybe let's also get rid of the scale. Okay, so if we want to use another clone, or if we want to gain control over another clone, for example, the 10th clone, we go to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It is this, but the number is 9 because it starts counting at 0. So let's type in 9 and hit enter, and then we address this clone. So maybe let's move the effector because I want to show you something else here. So what if you want to attach the clone directly to the effector, for example? This is also something you can do. And within the parameters tab, you set the transform mode to absolute and the transform space to effector. And now it will jump to the effector's position, but plus 50 here. So let's reduce this to 0. And now we can move the clone by moving the effector, which is quite powerful. But right now we cannot rotate it. So let's rotate the effector. The clone stays the same unless we also activate the rotation here. And now here comes the funny thing. You have to type in at least one change here. So if you type in 1 degree in heading, you will also get the rotation of the effector, and can use it for the clone. So yeah, and if you want to have another clone being applied to this effector, you just go to maybe, let's say, ID equals 15, then it is this clone. Yeah, exactly. So that's how you can gain control over a single clone using the formula effector.
Thank you for joining this webinar. And yeah, I really hope that I see you next time. I hope you enjoyed the webinar.